Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we are in 2 Timothy chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verse 13 this lesson, but before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, we see here in verse 13, Paul says, the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus, when you come, bring with you, and the books, but especially the parchments. Now, this word for cloak, it seems as I was studying, why would Paul want this cloak? Well, because back in those days, they had this garment. It looked like a parka. And it went over the body, and like today you have arms out, and it had a hole in the top, but it was very thick. It was almost like wearing a rug, but it kept the water out, it kept dampness out, it kept the wind out, and it seems that Paul, when he was taken prisoner, was taken very quickly, and he didn't have a chance to bring things with him. Remember, this imprisonment is completely different than the imprisonment that we saw Paul in Acts. But this one here, he seems to have been taken very quickly by the authorities, and he didn't have time to grab things and take with him. So now he's asking Timothy to bring some things with him. And he says, bring this cloak. I want the cloak. It's damp and it's kind of, cold down here in this prison. And I want this cloak to keep me warm and to keep the dampness out. And then he says, and bring with you also the books, but especially the parchments. Now, the books and the parchments, we don't know exactly what was written on these things, but it seems that on one of them, on either the books or the parchments, it seems that the Old Testament scriptures were on them. Now, we don't know for sure. But it seems that Paul wanted the Old Testament scriptures there in prison so that he could read and have the word of God there with him. And then he says in verse 14, Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. Now, the Greek word for coppersmith can refer to anyone who works with metal. It says coppersmith, but it could be any kind of metal worker. And concerning Alexander, it's possible that he is the same Alexander of 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20. And because Timothy is now in Ephesus, Alexander was more than likely a manufacturer of silver shrines to the god Diana. In Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 25, it seems that this is the same Alexander. And he says here, Alexander the coppersmith did me. Now, this Greek word for did is interesting. It's endichnoumi. And this Greek word literally means to show something or to display. So in the context, when Paul says Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil, it means that in context, Alexander showed Paul a lot of ill treatment. He gave Paul a lot of ill treatment. And it's also believed that Alexander could have been a Roman informant for the government. Now, we don't know for sure. We don't know if Alexander is the same Alexander. It seems like he is. Could Alexander have been saved at one time? Maybe. Or could he be a pretending Christian in order to inform, so that he would know a lot about Paul and the Christian faith, and that he could keep the government involved in what's going on? It's possible. Again, we don't know. But he says here, he did me much evil. And then he says, Paul says, concerning Alexander, the Lord reward him according to his works. Now, this Greek word for reward is apodidomai. And this Greek word used here, it does not imply that Paul was being vindictive or wanted revenge against Alexander in any way. What Paul is simply saying is that he's simply stating that at a future time, God is going to reward him. God's going to reward Alexander. God's going to give Alexander his rewards. And we see this same Greek word in Matthew chapter 6, verses 4 and 6 and 18, and also in chapter 16, verse 27, and Revelation chapter 18 and verse 6. Now, there's one more place where this Greek word apodidomai is used, and we see it in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12. And it's dealing with the unsaved. Now, the unsaved will be judged according to their works. This is the same thing what Paul said. Alexander will be judged in the future according to his works. Well, in Revelation 20, verse 12, the unsaved will be judged according to their works. And their works that they trust in to get them to heaven will be placed up against Christ's one work, his work on the cross. And in the end, they'll be found wanting. They'll be found, it's unacceptable. And they'll be sent to an eternity in a lake of fire. There will be no grace, no mercy, no compassion shown toward any one of the unsaved that are judged on that day. Only God's justice for all their rejection. The only thing that the unsaved will receive at the white throne judgment is God's justice and God's punishment against their rejection of Christ and what he did on the cross. And then he says in verse 15, of whom be thou ware also, for he has greatly withstood our words. So he says, of whom be thou ware. Now this Greek word for be thou ware is phulasso. And it means to guard, to watch, or to keep. And it's in the middle voice, which means that Timothy is to produce the action of guarding against Alexander. And Timothy will also receive the benefits of staying away from Alexander. Timothy is doing it for his own good. So Paul tells Timothy, Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. God's going to reward him. And then Paul says, be thou aware of him. Watch him, guard yourself, right? Be thou aware, stay away from him. And when you do, you'll be benefited by it, right? Of whom be thou ware, for he hath greatly withstood our words. Now, this Greek word for withstood means to be set against something or someone. It means to resist something. So, Alexander greatly resisted Paul's words. You know, every unsaved person is unsaved because ultimately, they have resisted. They have set themselves against the word of the gospel. They are of the world, and they love the darkness rather than the light. And the eyes of their understanding are darkened. And they are dead in trespasses and sins. The unsaved, the unregenerate person has a natural tendency to resist light and to resist truth. You know it. Before we were saved, that's what we did, right? We all, until we got saved, we all resisted the word of God. We all cringed when someone was sharing the gospel with us or telling us about church or something, right? We all were people of darkness. And in our hearts, we withstood the truth. We withstood the word of God. But the sad part is when Christians, for whatever reason, turn back to the world and start living in their old sin nature again. They begin living in that old resistance of prayer, that old resistance of church attendance, the old resistance of Bible reading and of fellowship with the saints. The things of God become foolishness unto them again, because they are walking in the natural man of 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. The way to prevent returning to the old man is to walk in the Spirit. Don't let your guard down. Daily walk in the Spirit. Don't let your guard down, because as soon as you do, your heart and your old sin nature is going to want to go back to the way it was, back to the world, back to the old lifestyle, back to the old, to start feeding the fleshly desires. Your flesh is going to want to feast on the things of this world because it's dead and it's dying. God judged it on the cross. He condemned it. That's why the flesh hates God. Our sinful nature hates God. But in order to prevent going back into the world, we need to daily walk in the Spirit. And we won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. All right? We're going to start verse 16 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.